What happened here was the de facto hijacking of a Ryanair flight by Belarusian intelligence operatives in order to arrest a political dissident. It's very, very clear, despite the attempted obfuscation by the regime, that that's precisely what took place. These are the actions of a desperate dictator. Lukashenko has been in power for 27 years, and their actions that people for profit obviously absolutely condemn. Lukashenko is a man who is under pressure of a mass movement from below to end his rule. He thinks that he can get away with these kind of actions in pursuit of their dictatorial agenda of repression. We should raise our voices to demand that all political prisoners should be immediately released. I think that the actions of Lukashenko in targeting Roman Protasevich are aimed not just obviously at Protasevich and his partner, not just at the right-wing opposition within Belarus, which I think they're probably a part of, but also at the wider opposition movement, including the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers who engaged in general strike action against Lukashenko. Where the current situation in Belarus comes from, the kind of immediate history, is the supposed elections in August of last year, where Lukashenko claimed and was widely ridiculed to have won over 80% of the vote. That provoked mass protests, mass movements from below, from workers who were opposed to the robbing of an election, were opposed to the repressive policies of the regime within Belarus, and were opposed to the agenda of privatization which is being implemented within Belarus. The response by the regime to those protests has been one of repression, repression, and repression. Over 30,000 activists have been arrested. Many people have been forced to leave the country, and there's been very widespread police and intelligence brutality against protesters, causing obviously significant injuries. So this is a horrendous regime, and although we as socialists would have political differences with Roman Protasevich, we defend his right to fly and not get his flight downed by the Belarusian regime, and not to be jailed for his political views. And we absolutely support the movement against Lukashenko, call for the privatization programs to be stopped, call for the Lukashenko regime to be overthrown, and instead for a system based on a workers' democracy to come into place. Well, one thing I would say to the movement in Belarus, if people happen to be watching, is to be careful not to be allowed to be used by the forces of Western imperialism that have no interest in the actual democratic rights of the ordinary people in Belarus, or the economic living standards and so on of working class people in Belarus, and are looking to engage in a new Cold War between Western imperialism and Russian imperialism, neither side of which represents the interests of ordinary working class people anywhere in the world. And that brings me to the final point I want to make, which is the hypocrisy that is present in the righteous condemnation, a correct condemnation of the actions of the Lukashenko regime. But nobody is asking the question, where did Lukashenko get the idea that he could down a flight? The government answer that question? Is it a coincidence that the Austrian government downed a flight in an act of international piracy just the same as the Lukashenko regime? Downed a flight with the elected head of state of Bolivia, downed the flight containing Morales because they thought that Edward Snowden was on board. An incredible same action of international piracy with no condemnation by the European Union or by the Irish government, and instead of offering asylum to the likes of Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, who has been mentioned, the government bows its head and only lifts a finger against Russia or states seen to be aligned to it whenever the major powers in Europe and in the US tell them to. And that's because this government is a government which is subservient to the interests of US and Western imperialism and is completely unwilling to take a principled moral and political stand against the actions taken by those governments and those states which are allied to them. It's a government which lets a foreign military power, the United States, use our infrastructure on its way to carry out its global campaign of war and terror. And the point about double standards applies. And again, to be clear, this is not whataboutery, because I am 100% on record and have been for years in opposition to the Lukashenko regime. In the European Parliament, I spoke out about the Lukashenko regime. I support a revolution against Lukashenko. But I ask that a government that correctly is able to condemn those attacks on democratic rights, those repressive actions, why aren't you willing to do it when it comes to the likes of the US government? We made the point in here about the US government brutally oppressing indigenous people at Standing Rock. We called on the then Fine Gael government to take action, to refuse to provide legitimacy to that regime, and to show clear and unconditional support for the indigenous people. It did not. The same happened in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, when you had police repression on the streets of the US, injuring thousands, and we called for a statement of opposition and to expel the US ambassador. You look at the actions, look at what's taking place in Guantanamo Bay. The US has more than its fair share of political prisoners, and yet this government would not be caught dead taking a stand.
Thank you, Deputy.